This is Test Case Scenario with me, your host, Jason Baum. This podcast is the definitive hub for knowledge and stories in the software testing and development communities. If you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button and let's dive straight into the episode. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Test Case Scenario. I'm one of your hosts, Jason Baum, and joining me today is Evelyn Coleman. Hey Evelyn.
Howdy, how's it going?
I'm good. How have you been?
I am doing great, and I am so happy to see my friend Titus here on the line. Titus Fortner has joined us today, and for those of you listening, Titus might go way back.
It's so good to see you.
6 years now.
Yeah.
6 years. That's a long time. Welcome back to the show, Titus.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's good to see you, Evan.
What about me?
Good to see you too, Jason.
Yeah, hi, Jason.
No, I want to hear it from him. That's okay.
Hey, boss, it's so good to see you.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's fine. Anyway, Titus is here by force.
Yes, you have to force me to talk about testing.
He's holding. Yeah, right. Exactly.
Right.
No, I have to force you to stop talking about testing. Yeah. Well, I'm really happy that you could join us today, Titus. We're going to be talking about a lot today, but I'm going to let Evelyn tee this off because Evelyn had a really good idea for today's episode. I want her to get all the credit.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, as our listeners know, our podcast is called Test Case Scenario. And one of the things we don't do very frequently is put our guests into scenarios. So today, as we're going to be talking about insights, analytics, and how we can use those to further our quality practice, we are going to put Titus in the hot seat, which is my favorite thing to do, is to question Titus relentlessly. And we are going to talk about put him in some scenarios and see how he would use data and analytics to sort out his quality problems. Not saying you have quality problems. You might. We don't know. We'll have to see what the data says. Jason, you want to start with scenario number one?
I'll start with scenario number one. All right. Your CI pipeline became slow. Too many tests. Is that possible? Begin to run during each build, causing delays in getting feedback to developers. Titus.
So this is like we've just added a bunch of tests and now things are slower and it's holding everything up. And
it's slowing down my CI pipeline.
Right.
What are you going to do about it?
Yeah, Titus.
There are a number of different ways that we could address this. The first thing is to figure out what our failure rate is, because my new saying is that your test suite hasn't finished running until you evaluated all the results, until you've investigated all the failures. So to a certain extent, you have to have a good pass rate in order for you to have a short test suite anyway. But really figuring out what your failures are, because you can decrease your total execution time by getting rid of the tests that aren't giving you useful information pretty quickly. So everything that's always failing is not actually giving you a useful signal if you're not actually looking at the results. So delete those. Or make your boss happy and move them to another test execute, tag them all something else and just don't run them, and tell your boss that things are, hey, look, everything's going faster. Isn't it great? Obviously, you need to figure out if they're important and fix the things and triage the things, but that's the first step. What's your pass rate? If your pass rate is good, then you can figure out the next step. But a lot of it is you could take a look at how long the different things are running, figure out how many different platforms you're running your tests on. You can see are you running on too many different platforms? Or like your coverage is also going to matter. So if you have a whole bunch of tests, but you're only doing Chrome and Windows, but most of your users are coming from Safari, right? Like that's not a useful test suite necessarily. So it's all figuring out the right number of tests that can be run in enough platforms so that you're getting useful information on every run. So don't be afraid to delete tests. Tag them as something else if your manager doesn't like it when you delete tests. I'm not a big fan of smoke tests and regression test suites because once you call something, this is a smoke test, this is the ones that we have to make sure are passing, and then here are all the regression tests, you're essentially saying, I don't care about the results of the regression test suite. The only caveat is if those tests are always failing, then yeah, call it a regression test suite. And the ones that you care about or that are getting useful information, put it in a smoke test. Anyway.
And you said the ones that are always failing, and you also said the ones that rarely fail, right?
An important thing to look at when you're looking at your failures is to differentiate between the tests that are always failing and the tests that are intermittently failing. And so,
all right, scenario 2, you have tests that are always failing, and you have some that are intermittently failing. How do you use analytics to go about sorting out which ones to fix and which ones to jettison?
Yeah, absolutely. You want to take a look at, you want to have a view, you need to have a dashboard, you have something that's going to show you some history and show you, hey, this test has been failing for X days or for X period of time, and this test is sometimes passing, sometimes failing. And the reason you want to differentiate those is the cause is always going to be different. It's not going to be the same fix for those two things. And so being able to filter out and just look at these things are always failing. And then you want to figure out, is there a common cause for a large number of these? You're going to get into triaging and figuring out what thing might I be able to fix that would fix a bunch of these. You'll sometimes see a site redesign and all of a sudden a bunch of things start failing on a certain date. And so like if you can look at your trends and say, all of a sudden we started getting a whole bunch of failures here, it's often a lot easier to see it visually than just looking at reports. So getting a visual for, on Wednesday of last week, all of a sudden we're seeing a whole bunch more failures consistently. And then take a look at like what page was changed. Oh, they redesigned this and now all my class names are different. So I have to change all the locators for these elements on these pages because they changed the class names without letting the testers know again. That's an important way to triage things, be able to split those up and tackle them separately.
Okay, got another one. Number 3, a critical bug has been discovered in production, leading to significant service outages. The team needs to roll out a fix, but doesn't know which tests to prioritize to ensure the fix doesn't cause regressions in other parts of the system. Which tests should you run before deploying the patch? What would you use to find out how or why?
Yeah, this is where coming up with like an intelligent tagging system really helps. If you're looking to speed up your test, you can figure out what section of the code was changed and then have certain tests tagged with that type. You are changing an it's an authentication change. You don't need to necessarily run, your reservation tests when the authentication changes, just run those tests. So tag those tests with the feature type. And so I say, don't separate your test suites into smoke tests and regression to the important and not important. Separate it by feature. And you can use all sorts of different, like we used Git at one of my previous companies and say, hey, if it's in this part of the tree, do this. And if it's not, run these tags, kind of a thing. And so you can split it up to focus just on those things. But that does require like pre-planning and figuring out what to do ahead of time. And ideally, the critical bug was caught by a test. You're saying it wasn't. We didn't have a test for it, and so it got out into production or something along those lines. And so we need to.
It got out.
Yeah, it got out, and we need to see
discovered in production.
Did the fix? Yeah,
but you need to roll out the fix, but you're not sure which test to prioritize to ensure the fix doesn't cause regressions in other parts of the system.
Yeah, so like the approach that I see a lot of people taking is like, let's run a subset of tests on every commit kind of a thing, and that would be useful for this, and then run the full cross-browser, cross-platform test suite every night. So like, we didn't touch the login system. Well, let's run this stuff. Let's run everything tonight just in case something somewhere affected it and we didn't realize it would. So
I would assume that you'd also have to consider how efficient your tests are in general. Like if you've gone through all these exercises and all these best practices that Titus and some of the other smart minds in testing have put out there, ideally, you've gotten your testing down to a pretty short and sweet. And maybe you could just run your regular schmegular tests. Maybe it wouldn't take that long. Also depending on the size of your website, how many tests there are. Like if you've only got 100 tests, just run them.
Yeah. The other piece to this is, like that's a common thing in Sauce Labs, right? Is that people will say, hey, my tests are running so much slower on Sauce Labs than they are locally. And yes, part of that is latency. Every command has to be sent from your computer to our computer and execute. And when you're running locally, those commands are essentially like microseconds, right? Like they're super fast. And then when you're on Sauce, it's like, oh, they add up. Generally, for a given test, I expect it to be 2 to 3 times slower on Sauce Labs, but the point is that you make up for it by running it all in parallel. And so you really need to parallelize. That's the first thing, is just run more in parallel, get more sessions, figure out how many sessions it makes sense for you to run to get your build results in the time you need. So that's the first thing. There's also efficiency. Like a lot of frameworks were written with the understanding that commands are free, right? Like, hey, they're microseconds. It doesn't matter how many we run. It's kind of, I call it smart but stupid. You're doing a whole lot of work to synchronize your code with your site, but all of that work ends up biting you because it's very inefficient when you run remotely. And so you need to find a way to minimize the number of commands that you send. And, I've got a number of strategies that I talk about when I give talks and things about ways you can make your test suite more efficient so that it executes remotely better. And there's a number of other things you can do by looking at error rates and things, abandoned tests. There's all sorts of, that's another thing that you can use analytics for, is dialing into the error messages. One of the common ones we see at Sauce Labs is the 90-second timeout error. And no one really understands that error. It's one of the crazy ones. I'm like, oh, we got a timeout error. Obviously, we just need to bump up how much time the timeout is set for. It's just like, no, that makes it worse. That's the opposite of what you want to do. Figure out why Sauce Labs thinks you're abandoning your test and fix that rather than just increasing a timeout, because that's just going to be that much longer before you have access to that session again. So really dialing into your errors is another thing that helps you speed things up, because then you actually are paying for a session that you don't have access to every time that you have some of these errors that are having to time out before it gives you access again.
Well, Titus, it would not be a hot seat if the questions didn't get harder. All right. Scenario 4, I think. You're here, right? You've gotten through this website redesign. You got through this regression. You got through your CI/CD pipeline slowing down. And now you are the manager who has gone through all of this. And you're very relieved because that was a lot. It's such a short amount of time. I mean, only like 15 minutes. You had to go through all of the situations.
Talk about speed.
Man, yeah.
I know, but you wake up, it's all behind you, and your manager asks you, hey, how's quality going? What are we looking at?
Yeah, this is one of the hardest questions to answer, because one of my colleagues, Jason Coleman, was posted on LinkedIn recently talking about how important it is that testers quantify risks for release. And then he got some pushback by some people like, what do you mean quantify? How do you quantify? And I'm just like, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, yeah, so much of the metrics that a lot of us have are essentially units of warm fuzzies. And Sauce Labs in the past has talked about digital confidence as the thing that we need to do, the thing that we're focused on. And so confidence is a feeling. It's a little arbitrary. And so, like, how are you quantifying confidence? What scale is your warm fuzzies in, kind of thing, for how is quality? And obviously, a lot of this has to do with context. A lot of this has to do with how you feel about your coverage, your risk profiles. Like, a lot of it's industry specific too. Like, Twitter can get away with annoying users constantly and people are still addicted to the site. Whereas if you've got a mobile game, you annoy someone in the first few minutes, they're, users going to be like, oh, not this one, and go on to the next one. So it really depends on your risk profile for the company that your application, what it's supposed to do, figuring out what things are going to affect the bottom line of the company. I don't know, a lot of the talks I give, one of the early slides is a dollar sign. It's like, what does the money want? What is the board, the investors, the CEO, your boss's boss, what are they looking for from the application itself? And that's keeping users and making users happy and keeping them coming back and being being the choice that people move to away from competitors. And that's really needing velocity to fix things. So you've got to improve bugs quickly. Another thing I love to do is at conferences is ask everyone to raise their hand if their primary job is preventing bugs from getting into production. And everyone raises their hand. And you're like, all right, keep your hand up if you've never had a bug get into production. And everyone puts their hands down and laughs. It's a great thing. And we're just like, you all have one job and you can't even do it. And so if we literally put all of the time and energy we could into preventing any bug from getting out, we spent too much money. The cost benefit is way too high. So you have to figure out the balance between what are the most important errors, what are the most damaging, what's the CrowdStrike scenarios versus what are the things most likely to break. And then you've figured out what your test cases are that should give you the indication that you need for the things that you figured out. So a lot of it is just someone needs to sit and think through all of the things. And then you need to make sure that the test cases that you have that are giving you useful information about your app are would actually catch all of those things properly. You have to trust the process. So that, I guess that's the thing, is it's the process. You figure out the process and then you have to execute on the process and then trust that process. And the analytics that you're looking at in order to do that are going to be a little tricky because, again, make sure that your coverage is good. You want to base your coverage on what the users are actually using. You want to make sure that your frequency of tests, I would say like the intermediate test strategy is to run your tests every night and get results every evening. And the advanced strategy is a time-based strategy where you're running after every commit or every pull request, merge, that kind of a thing, where you're getting actionable feedback on specific code that's being changed instead of just taking the temperature of the code base every night. That's probably another process that allows you to more rapidly check those things. So fast feedback per commit, having a process, thinking through all of the test cases. And I guess that's the other thing is if like I said before, making sure that you've evaluated all of the failures. If you've got a test suite where you can't evaluate all of the failures every time it executes before you execute the next thing, then your quality, you should not have confidence in the quality of the code that you're executing. So it's vital that you have a low failure rate so that you can evaluate everything, so that all of the test cases that you've decided are important enough to catch the likely problems or the really bad problems. But context is the easy out for most of this.
Yeah, use that soft failure analysis tool. Cool. So I've got what is this? We're up to 5? 5 already. Wow, feels like we just started.
I mean, you say stuff and then I'll just keep talking until...
That's okay. Yeah, that's like not like it's just a normal day, right? Or I've got to zap them. Okay. So a lot of SaaS customers are major enterprises, right? Fortune 200 and above, and their teams are doing feature rollouts across multiple regions, right? So I'll give you that scenario of your team's rolling out a new feature across several regions, starting with a small percentage of users in each, right? That's a best practice. Early reports are indicating the feature's performing well in some, but has issues in others. How do you prioritize the test cases and adjust testing strategies based on that real-time performance data?
Like production monitoring is giving feedback in some areas that there are problems.
Yeah, that's what production monitoring is basically telling you.
Right.
A feature's performing well in some regions, but there are issues in others.
A very common thing in testing is doing automatic retries, where test fails, run it a couple times, and we'll only pay attention to it if it fails 4 times in a row, and then we'll pay attention to it, something like that. I've seen ridiculous retry strategies. It's just like you've got big problems you've got to address here. A good practice if you're doing automatic retries is to take a look at the things that are failing regularly and see what's going on. So like, again, if you're going to do automatic retries, be smart about it. Anyway, the point of this is there was a test case that was failing 50% of the time. And so it would, you run it 3 times and it's pretty much always going to pass. So we ignored it, look at it. And it turned out we debugged it. It turned out it was a load balancer. One server was configured differently from another server. And it was the functional tests that caught it because the configuration broke something in the release. And it was 50% of the time. It was just like, oh yeah, so load balancer, 2 servers, 50% of the time. So if you're seeing stuff that is different in the different regions based on monitoring, that's one thing I would take a look at. Testing, geolocation testing is also a thing. Usually, geolocation is really hard because most applications figure out determine your location based on your IP address. So like there's a lot of ways to set in software. I'm going to change the time zone. I'm going to change the, whatever on the system. And it's like, that's not what the application is using. And so you really do end up needing to use a proxy server of some kind and say, give me an IP address in this country. So that's probably another thing that I would look at doing, is trying to run the test suite on the staging environment, on your test server, but do it from one of the regions you're seeing problems in and see if there's something there. There's a company I worked at. It was an e-commerce company that had some of the products had alcohol in them, and so you couldn't transport them overseas. Right, so like hand cleaner or something that had a certain amount of alcohol in it, and so it was restricted from travel. Or no, like Alaska, you couldn't order some of those products in Alaska. So there were certain things that we tested to make sure that if the zip code is an Alaska zip code, will it prevent you from checking out with that item? So there could be stuff like that you're not testing, that you might need to make sure that you're testing. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm actually answering the.
You didn't, but you told a really nice story.
Some anecdotes and throw
story time with Titus. I like, Titus, how you give an answer, like when you're not 100% sure of the answer to a question, you start a story and answer a completely separate question, but you talk for so long that eventually you think that the answer to the question was answered in the question, in the answer.
This actually comes from the Navy, the nuclear power school, where you're never supposed to say you don't know. You're always supposed to just kind of think about things related and start talking and just keep saying true things. And then maybe the person that's interviewing you can nudge you in the right direction or ask some follow-ups. And so yeah, you just start saying true things related as best you can to the topic, and then see if you stumble on the truth that's trying to be obtained.
Yeah, similar. I grew up in a Navy town and can confirm.
Got the veterans here today.
Yeah, yay. Yay? Anyways. All right, for all the coins, I have the scenario to the king of scenarios here, scenario number 6. You've done so well in your day-to-day job of battling all of these issues, and then also answering your manager's question about what to do with testing, that you've been invited onto a podcast about test modeling
That's great.
to talk about how you use data and analytics in your day-to-day and teach other people. What are the sort of like hidden pitfalls and things that you would want to tell the listeners of that podcast, which is not on this podcast?
Evelyn's questions are just on another level better than my questions.
It was fine.
We're getting meta. Great. I laugh, but then so using analytics, it's interesting because I feel like there's 2 different use cases for analytics. One is what you show your manager to kind of justify what you're doing, and the other is what you can use to take actionable results and triage test failures and do your job better. So I don't usually think in terms of the first one very well. I was never very good at showing my work to my manager in a way that I'm like, I'm too busy getting stuff done, like make your own chart, which they didn't appreciate as much, shocking. But like seeing coverage reports, seeing frequency, seeing usage numbers, those are all things that managers like to see to justify. That's probably the real answer to the previous question. But I'm more interested in what can I look at to be able to fix my failures, like figure out, triage what's going on, what's not. This is where I like being able to split up the always failing from the intermittently failing tests. SoftLabs has a feature, failure analysis, that tries to use machine learning to figure out what common patterns there are in your failures and highlight those specifically. I mostly find that useful for grouping things. And so it's not necessarily what failure is like, this is failing for this reason or this collection. And it's what it's saying isn't nearly as important as it's saying all of these are similar. And so like, that's a great way to start, is take a look at what similar things are failing. And then you can see if like, yes, the login page is broken, or so all of the login things are failing. Or again, you see that they did a site redesign on something. And so everything, we're trying to find the submit button and it's not there anymore. So that's a good place. And then the next place is just dialing into, these are the things that started failing at a certain point. This is why it's super useful to do the event-based testing instead of the time-based testing. Is like you can see exactly when things started failing. You can pinpoint the exact code that changed it, as opposed to who changed the reservation system on Thursday, which is an actual question I've asked in the past to developers. So digging into the history of a test and seeing what's going on, and then there's just the flakiness issues that you're constantly fighting with your synchronization strategies, making sure that your code isn't running faster than the browser and that things are keeping up. And those are the ones that take the most time. So if you can figure out the other stuff to get quick wins, then you can have more time for the harder things that are trickier to solve in the long term.
Titus, what's the one piece of advice that you might have for testers in general? Well, maybe testing management right now. We've had a lot of talks about shift left, shift right, shift nothing. There's nothing shifting. I feel like this is a different time for QA right now. Perhaps traditional QAs feel threatened. I guess SDETs are developers at this point. Are there is the SDET role? Maybe not. I don't know. It depends on the org.
Or which blogs you're reading. I don't know. We like to talk about trends. It's interesting. I visited two banks in short separation time last year. And one of them I was talking about, like testing moving to a developer responsibility. And they laughed at me like, that will never happen. We're a bank. And then I go to the next bank. I'm like, yeah, so we've been doing this for the last year. We're doing this and this other thing. And, and it even varies from team to team at a large scale. Like we're talking Fortune 200 companies. They've got dozens of teams that are doing testing. And the futures here is just unevenly distributed, right? Is that kind of a thing for testing at these companies. And some of them really are trying to, hey, what happens if we let the developers be responsible for their own code? Are they going to catch all the problems? And anyway, did I interrupt your question?
You did, but that's okay because you helped define where I was going with my question. It's a very long, drawn out. I do the long, drawn out questions. But like for a manager of QA, what is my role? Am I managing developers? Am I managing QAs? Am I managing both? Am I managing, it just feels like an area that is it used to be very defined and split. Perhaps that's not the way to do it. But what is it now? And if I'm going into that, what advice do you have for me? Is there hope?
Yeah, so we're seeing all the different combinations right now, right? Like it used to be that you'd have a completely separate department that didn't even talk to developers, and they would be doing the QA, and it's completely independent. You're doing these monolith applications. And then we switched to kind of the matrix thing where you're reporting to a QA manager, but you're assigned to a specific dev team. And so you're embedded in the team, but your manager still focused on testing things. And then a lot of just QA managers are kind of going away and the developers are the ones. So I don't know. I think one of the takeaways that I had from the international incident a few months ago is someone needs to be responsible for the nightmare scenarios. Like
they're talking about CrowdStrike?
Yes.
Okay.
I would be willing to bet that there was a test that should have caught that problem and it didn't. I don't know that. I would bet that because that's a very common thing in our industry is that there are tests that are supposed to catch important things that don't. Marcus Merrill, friend of the pod, he tells a story and I love it, is that the entire staging environment went down one night and the test suite ran against a staging environment that was offline. And he came in the next morning and 36 tests had passed. It's just like, all right, so if it's impossible for this test to fail, then what is it actually testing? And is it giving you the value that you think it is? And that's just a very common thing, is we think we're covered and we're not. And so a manager needs to make sure that they know what the nightmare scenarios are, the important combinations, and then try and hold people accountable. And I think this is where we're trying to figure out as an industry, as people are trying out, what happens if you get rid of QA and make the devs do it. It's like, are the devs actually thinking through the nightmares? Are they thinking about regression, or are they focused on component testing and acceptance test instead of, hey, am I breaking old code, instead of, did I write the current code correctly? Someone needs to be able to sign off on this code is good enough to put in front of users in some fashion. And that means having a process and thinking through the things. And that's the thing that I'm concerned that the industry might lose if we completely move to the developers are doing it. I definitely push back on the idea that only devs can make things and only testers can break things. I think that's a false dichotomy, and I get really frustrated. There's a lot of politics that goes into those ideas and ideas of identity for that, but it's a learned thing, and developers absolutely can learn that, but they need to be held accountable for learning those things instead of just being told they're responsible for it.
That answered my question. Bring us home, Evelyn, please.
Titus, it's been very lovely having you on. Thank you for being willing to be in the hot seat, even though the questions, you were not warned that they would get harder as we went.
Oh no, I have to give opinions about testing and tell stories.
Titus said it to me best about like his opinion. He holds strong opinion. What is it like? Strong opinions, loosely held, or something?
Yeah,
like that?
weekly hold strong opinions is the idea.
Thank you. That's much better.
No, it's one of those important things, is being open to change your mind when you get new information, but when like really fight for the things that you believe in the moment.
Yeah,
that makes sense. But we appreciate having you on. We appreciate you hosting, Jason. For those of you listening out there, this has been another episode of Test Case Scenario.
Thanks again.
And thank you both.
Thank you for joining us on Test Case Scenario. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'll make sure to respond to each and every single one. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to keep in touch. If you missed our last episode, it's popping up on your screen right now. Go, click it. Until next time on Test Case Scenario.